Hey everyone, and welcome back to Hacker News Daily. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's top stories that had the tech community absolutely buzzing. Out of 30 major stories on Hacker News, we've pulled the 5 that dominated the discussion, and wow, do we have some fascinating themes emerging today. We're seeing a real pattern here, from AI pushing boundaries while hitting safety walls, to government intervention reshaping entire industries, to fundamental questions about privacy and trade in our increasingly complex digital world. These aren't just tech stories, they're stories about how technology is colliding with policy, economics, and basic rights in ways we're only beginning to understand. So buckle up, because we're starting with Google's latest AI bombshell that's got everyone talking about both its incredible capabilities and its frustrating limitations. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? The safety restrictions are apparently driving people up the wall. Multiple users are reporting that about half their prompts get rejected, especially anything involving humans. One frustrated commenter called it basically useless for real-world applications because of these filters. Imagine trying to use this for professional work and having legitimate editing requests blocked because the safety system is too trigger-happy. That's gotta be frustrating. What's really interesting is the performance comparisons people are running. Someone in the comments ran strict prompt adherence tests, and it scored 8 out of 12, which puts it right up there competing with GPT-4 and Imagen. That's a massive leap from previous versions. But then you've got other folks pointing out that it still can't render a piano keyboard correctly, which, for a state-of-the-art model, that's kind of embarrassing. One commenter mentioned it's more like we're in the GPT 3.5 phase rather than a true revolution, and honestly, that feels about right. The multimodal capabilities are where things get really wild, though. Users are reporting they can blend multiple images together, maintain consistency across edits, and the model actually understands context between different elements in an image. Someone in the discussion thread was talking about using it for storytelling, keeping the same character consistent across multiple scenes. That's the kind of thing that used to require hours of manual work or expensive custom solutions. There's also this underlying current of concern in the discussion that I think we need to talk about. A few users brought up the elephant in the room, the potential for misuse. We're talking automated blackmail bots, deepfakes, the whole 9 yards. One commenter was pretty blunt about being worried about the societal impact. And yeah, when image manipulation gets this good and this cheap, those concerns aren't exactly unfounded. The availability is immediate across Google's whole ecosystem. You can grab it through the Gemini API if you're a developer, play with it in Google AI Studio, which apparently has some enhanced build mode features now, or if you're enterprise, it's on Vertex AI. They're clearly pushing for wide adoption fast. You know what strikes me most about this whole thing? It's the tension between incredible technical achievement and practical limitations. On one hand, you've got people absolutely gushing about the editing capabilities, calling it revolutionary. On the other, you've got the same people pulling their hair out because they can't generate a simple professional headshot edit without triggering safety filters. It's like having a Ferrari with a speed limiter stuck at 30 miles per hour. Sure, it's impressive engineering, but can you actually use it for what you need? The Nano Banana codename, though, I keep coming back to that. Some folks in the comments are speculating it hints at the model being smaller and more efficient, which would explain the aggressive pricing. But honestly, it just makes me think someone at Google lost a bet or something. Either way, this is definitely one to watch. If they can sort out those safety restrictions without compromising on actual safety, this could genuinely reshape the image generation landscape. And speaking of AI pushing boundaries, that theme of powerful capabilities hamstrung by safety concerns continues with our next story, where Anthropic is literally giving AI control of your browser, with some pretty alarming security implications. All right, now we're diving into something that's got the Hacker News crowd absolutely buzzing, and not in a good way. Claude for Chrome just dropped, and oh boy, the reactions are intense. So Anthropic is rolling out this Chrome extension that basically gives Claude the ability to take control of your browser. We're talking clicking buttons, filling out forms, seeing everything you're looking at, the whole 9 yards. They're starting small with just 1,000 max plan users, which, given what I'm about to tell you, seems like a pretty smart move. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Internally, they've been using this thing for all sorts of tasks: managing calendars, scheduling meetings, drafting emails, handling expense reports, even testing website features. Sounds amazing, right? Like having a super competent assistant who never needs coffee breaks? But here's the kicker. Even after implementing their safety measures, they're admitting to an 11% attack success rate. 11%! The Hacker News community is having a field day with this one. One commenter described it as a lethal trifecta of vulnerabilities. And honestly, when you think about it, they're not wrong. You've got an AI that can see all your private data, it's exposed to whatever random content appears on the web, and it can communicate externally. That's basically the perfect storm for data exfiltration attacks. What's fascinating is how this introduces a whole new category of cybersecurity threats. We've spent years teaching people not to fall for phishing attacks, and now we're potentially giving AI assistants the ability to fall for them on our behalf. There's something called prompt injection attacks, where malicious actors can hide instructions in websites, emails, or documents that trick the AI into doing harmful things. Imagine visiting a website that has hidden text telling Claude to email your banking details somewhere. Yikes! The technical limitations are pretty sobering, too. Several developers in the comments pointed out that current AI models just aren't great at dealing with web page complexity. They lose context during interactions. They struggle with things as basic as understanding multiple radio buttons. One person mentioned watching these AI agents try to navigate modern web apps is like watching someone try to solve a Rubik's Cube while wearing oven mitts. But here's what really caught my attention. There's this underlying urgency in Anthropic's announcement. They explicitly mention that browser-using agents powered by frontier models are already emerging, which that's corporate speak for our competitors are doing this too, and we can't afford to fall behind. It's like we're in this AI arms race where everyone knows the technology isn't quite ready, but nobody wants to be the last one to market. There was one contrarian view that I found absolutely fascinating, though. This commenter, R08 at HN, suggested that everyone's missing the real disruption here. They called it the TikTokification of the browser, the idea that AI could fundamentally change how we navigate the web, potentially disrupting Google's entire business model. Instead of searching and clicking through results, you just tell Claude what you want, and it handles everything. That's actually kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Look, I get the appeal. The demos probably look incredible. The productivity gains could be massive. But when your own safety testing shows that 1 in 9 attacks still gets through, that's not a bug. That's a feature you really don't want. It's like Anthropic is saying, hey, we built this amazing robot Bitler, but there's a small chance it might steal your silverware and mail it to Romania. The controlled rollout to just 1,000 users feels less like a beta test and more like containment protocol. They're clearly aware of the risks, which I guess is better than the alternative, but it does make you wonder if we're moving too fast here. The web wasn't designed with AI agents in mind, and retrofitting security onto something this powerful feels like trying to child-proof a chainsaw. What really gets me is that this is just the beginning. If Anthropic's right about their competitors working on similar tools, we're about to see a flood of AI browser agents hitting the market, each with their own security vulnerabilities and quirks. The next few months are going to be interesting, to say the least. Speaking of digital privacy and security concerns, at least there's some good news on that front. Well, if you happen to live in Michigan. All right, so here's something that should make privacy advocates sit up and take notice. Our next story comes from Michigan, where the state Supreme Court just ruled that unrestricted phone searches violate the Fourth Amendment. And honestly, it's about time we had some clarity on this. You know what's wild? We carry these devices that contain basically our entire lives. Messages, photos, banking info, location history, you name it. And until now, the legal framework around searching them has been this murky gray area. The Michigan Supreme Court basically said, no, you can't just rummage through someone's entire digital life because you arrested them for, say, a traffic violation. What really caught my eye in the Hacker News discussion was this comment from someone claiming to be a magistrate. They're saying they regularly see warrant requests from law enforcement that are essentially fishing expeditions. Like, we arrested this person for shoplifting, so we want to search their entire phone for anything. And apparently, when they push back and ask for something more specific, the officers often just withdraw their request entirely. That's concerning, right? It suggests they know they don't have probable cause for what they're actually looking for. And the community reaction has been interesting. It's this mix of cautious optimism and deep cynicism. One commenter called it a sudden outbreak of common sense, which, yeah, fair point. But then you've got all these other folks pointing out the elephant in the room: enforcement. How do you actually stop an officer from looking at more than they're supposed to once they have your unlocked phone? It's not like there's a technical limitation that says you can only look at text messages from Tuesday. And this brings up the whole parallel construction issue that several commenters mentioned. For those unfamiliar, that's when law enforcement finds evidence illegally, then constructs a parallel legal path to discover the same evidence. It's basically laundering illegal searches, and apparently it happens more than we'd like to think.
Here's the kicker, though. Someone pointed out that Michigan is entirely within the 100-mile border zone, where CBP claims broader search authority. So depending on how you interpret various court rulings, this whole Michigan Supreme Court decision might not even apply to federal agents operating in the state. The entire state. We're not talking about Detroit being close to Canada here. We're talking about the whole state potentially being exempt from this protection. What strikes me about this whole situation is how it highlights the massive gap between our legal system and our technology. The Fourth Amendment was written when a search meant physically going through someone's papers and effects. Now we're trying to apply those same principles to devices that can store millions of pages of documents, track our location 24/7, and record virtually every interaction we have. The pragmatic side of this is fascinating too. Several commenters who seem to have law enforcement experience basically confirmed what we all suspected, that phone searches often go way beyond what's authorized. One person described how they've seen officers accidentally stumble upon things outside the scope of their warrant, and then suddenly that becomes probable cause for a new, broader search. It's this recursive expansion of authority that the Michigan court seems to be pushing back against. You know what really resonated with me? The comment about how this is just Michigan, just one state out of 50, and we desperately need federal-level protection here. Because right now, your Fourth Amendment rights regarding your phone depend on which side of a state line you're standing on. And that's not how constitutional rights should work. The technical crowd on Hacker News also brought up some interesting points about encryption and biometric unlocking. Like, this ruling is great and all, but if you're compelled to unlock your phone with your face or fingerprint, does it matter what limits are supposedly on the search? It's another example of the law struggling to keep up with technology. I think what we're seeing here is a small but significant step toward acknowledging that our phones aren't just phones. They're repositories of our entire digital existence, and they deserve the same protection as our homes, maybe even more so. Because let's be honest, most of us have more private information on our phones than we do in our filing cabinets at home.
The skeptics in the thread have a point, though. Without real enforcement mechanisms, without real consequences for overreach, this ruling might just be words on paper. But hey, at least it's a start. At least one state Supreme Court is saying this isn't okay. Now we just need 49 more to follow suit, and maybe some federal legislation that actually understands what a smartphone is in 2024. Now, from digital rights to international trade chaos, let's talk about how new U.S. tariff requirements are literally breaking the global electronics supply chain. All right,
Now we're diving into a story that's causing absolute chaos in the tech hardware world. We regret but have to temporarily suspend the shipments to USA. And folks, this one's got the Hacker News community fired up with over 550 comments. This is about European electronics companies basically throwing their hands up and saying, we literally can't ship to America anymore. So here's what's happening. The US just rolled out these new tariff requirements that are, and I'm not exaggerating here, bringing international shipping to its knees. Companies like Olimax, they make open source hardware and development boards, they're having to completely suspend shipments to the United States. And they're not alone. We're talking Swiss Post, Italian postal services, German shippers, Scandinavian postal services. They've all hit the pause button on commercial shipments to the US. The core issue? These new rules require incredibly precise declarations about the steel, copper, and aluminum content in products. And when I say precise, I mean down to trace amounts. Think about a printed circuit board for a second. You've got copper traces, maybe some steel and connectors, possibly aluminum in heat sinks. How is a small electronics company supposed to measure the exact percentage of copper in a PCB that might have components from a dozen different suppliers? It's practically impossible. One commenter put it perfectly. They said, this is like asking a bakery to list the exact mineral content of their flour. The implementation was apparently rolled out with almost no warning, unclear requirements, and no practical way for small businesses to comply. We're not talking about companies trying to dodge regulations here. These are businesses that want to follow the rules, but literally cannot figure out what the rules are asking for. The economic ripple effects are already starting to show. People in the discussion are reporting that their only option now is to use FedEx or UPS, which, yeah, that's going from maybe 20 euros for postal shipping to over 100 euros for courier services. For hobbyists ordering development boards or small electronic components, that's a deal breaker. One person mentioned they used to order regularly from European suppliers, but now they're completely priced out. What's really interesting is the debate about whether this is intentional or just incompetence. There's this one commenter, L. Gleason, who actually defends the tariffs, saying, look, this is about encouraging U.S. manufacturing. It's about plugging the holes in our trade policy. But even they admit the enforcement is a mess. Meanwhile, the vast majority of commenters see this as economic self-harm of the highest order. Here's the thing that really gets me. Multiple people in the thread are pointing out that this might actually push more business to China. Think about it. If European suppliers can't ship to the US affordably and US companies need components, where are they going to turn? The very country these tariffs were supposedly meant to compete against. It's almost poetic in its irony. Some companies are apparently finding workarounds. There's mention of tech platforms like Flexport that might be handling the complexity successfully. But for small businesses, independent makers, hobbyists, they're just locked out. One commenter called it the end of an era for international tech collaboration. And honestly, they might not be wrong. The timing is particularly brutal because we're talking about right after the holiday season, when many small businesses are already stretched thin. And the lack of clear communication means companies are finding out about these requirements when packages are literally being returned at the border. You know what really stands out in this discussion? The sheer frustration from the international community. These aren't people trying to game the system. These are engineers, makers, small business owners who just want to sell their products. And now they're caught in this bureaucratic nightmare where even if they wanted to comply, the requirements are so vague and so technically challenging that compliance becomes impossible. The consensus in the comments seems to be that this is going to backfire spectacularly. We're potentially looking at reduced innovation, higher prices for consumers, and, ironically, a shift of business away from U.S. allies toward the very competitors these policies were meant to challenge. It's almost poetic in its irony. And speaking of government intervention in the tech sector, our final story takes this theme to a whole new level. with the US government literally buying a piece of Intel. All right, let's dive into something that's got the tech world pretty fired up, the story about US Intel. Or more specifically, the US government taking a 10% equity stake in Intel Corporation for nearly $9 billion. This one really struck a nerve on Hacker News, pulling in almost 400 points and over 400 comments. And honestly, I can see why. So here's what happened. The Trump administration announced that the federal government is going to buy a 10% equity stake in Intel Corporation for $8.9 billion. And look, if you know anything about American economic philosophy over the past few decades, this is, well, it's kind of jaw-dropping. We're talking about the US government literally becoming a shareholder in one of America's most iconic tech companies. Not a loan, not a grant, actual ownership. The reactions have been absolutely fascinating to watch unfold. You've got free market advocates basically having a meltdown, with folks like Scott Lincecum calling this a dangerous turn in American industrial policy. They're arguing this throws decades of market-oriented principles right out the window. And then on the other side, you've got people saying, look, semiconductor manufacturing is so critical to national security that we can't just leave this to market forces anymore. What's really interesting here is the timing. This is coming from a Republican administration, traditionally the party of small government and free markets, right? But the national security angle is apparently compelling enough to override those principles. And when you dig into the discussion threads, the Taiwan factor keeps coming up over and over again. People are essentially saying, what happens if China makes a move on Taiwan and suddenly TSMC, which manufactures most of the world's advanced chips, is offline or under Chinese control? One commenter made a point that really stuck with me. They said Intel's problems aren't really about money. It's about talent drain. Years of bad strategic decisions, focusing too much on stock buybacks instead of R&D. Basically, they've been getting their lunch eaten by TSMC for years now. And the question is, does adding government ownership actually fix any of those fundamental issues? Or does it just add a new layer of political considerations on top of already struggling business decisions? There was this fascinating alternative perspective from a user called 9999000000999, who suggested instead of trying to save Intel as this monolithic entity, why not create multiple smaller fab companies that focus on basic chips? Their argument was that most applications, your washing machine, your car's brake system, whatever, they don't need cutting-edge 3-nanometer processors. They need reliable, basic chips that we can definitely manufacture domestically. And then there's this whole other angle about international precedents. People brought up how the German government owns a stake in Volkswagen, how China has state involvement in tons of companies. Some folks are saying, well, if everyone else is doing industrial policy, maybe we need to play that game too. Others are arguing that's exactly the wrong lesson to learn. What really caught my attention was a comment from someone with a Chinese perspective, username Diog, who basically said, look, China is going to surpass TSMC within 10 years, regardless of what the US does, and Taiwan isn't really about semiconductors anyway. Now, whether you believe that or not, it's a reminder that this isn't happening in a vacuum. There's this whole geopolitical chess game happening around semiconductor manufacturing. The board governance questions are pretty wild too. Like, if the government owns 10% of Intel, do they get a board seat? How do you handle situations where national security interests clash with what's best for the other 90% of shareholders? One commenter pointed out that Intel might start making decisions based on which senator's district needs jobs rather than where it makes the most business sense to build a fab. You know what's kind of ironic? Some people in the thread pointed out that Intel has already received billions in subsidies through the CHIPS Act, and they're still struggling. So now we're doubling down with actual equity ownership. It's like, At what point do we admit that maybe Intel's problems run deeper than what government money can fix? The whole discussion really highlights this fundamental tension in modern tech policy. On one hand, semiconductors are absolutely critical infrastructure. They're in everything from smartphones to missiles. On the other hand, government ownership of private companies has, let's say, a mixed track record at best when it comes to innovation and efficiency. What really caught my attention in all of this was that even the critics seem to acknowledge the problem is real. Nobody's really arguing that depending on Taiwan for most of our advanced chips is a great situation. The debate is really about whether this particular solution, government equity stakes, is the right answer, or if we're just creating new problems while failing to solve the original ones.
And that's a wrap on yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a day, right? We saw AI pushing incredible boundaries while simultaneously frustrating users with safety restrictions, government intervention reshaping everything from semiconductor manufacturing to international trade, and courts finally starting to grapple with what digital privacy actually means in 2024. What really strikes me about today's stories is how they all circle around this central tension. We're building incredibly powerful technologies, but our legal, economic, and security frameworks are struggling to keep up. Whether it's AI that can manipulate images but won't let you edit a headshot, tariffs that accidentally break global supply chains, or a government buying stakes in tech companies, we're clearly in this messy transition period where the old rules don't quite work, but we haven't figured out the new ones yet. These were the 5 stories that dominated discussion yesterday out of 30 major posts on Hacker News, generating thousands of comments and really getting the community thinking about where we're headed as an industry and as a society. Thanks for tuning in to Hacker News Daily. If you enjoyed this deep dive into yesterday's top tech stories, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's episode. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. I'll catch you tomorrow with another round of the stories that matter most to the tech community. Take care, everyone.